There we are. Yes, do take your seats, particularly members of Parliament in the front row. Good morning and welcome to RUSI. Secretary of State, First Sea Lord, all our speakers at this conference, the First Sea Lord Sea Power Conference for 2019. And as I wrote in my introduction to the programme, RUSI is particularly proud of its relationship with the Royal Navy, having been originally established, if you go back to 1831, foremost as a naval and military institute, as the intellectual friendly forces for you, the senior service. And that continues today through our military sciences research programme, through the Gallipoli Memorial Lectures, which the First Sea Lord himself gave a couple of years ago, and through events like this annual conference. Of course, today is not just about the Royal Navy, but all those interested in sea power, whether our guests from international navies or the wider defence enterprise here in the UK, whether wider government or the private sector, from academics like those here at the Institute to the media and civil society. So welcome to everyone. We appreciate all of your contributions. There are a few rules, of course, housekeeping rules about the conference. Catering will be provided upstairs, I'm told to say, and sessions announced a few minutes before starting. There are evacuation procedures. You should look to the session chair in an emergency, who will direct, and the RUSI staff will escort. And you either depart through the lobby onto Whitehall for the assembly point by the first statue on the left, or you depart the rear fire exits towards the Ministry of Defence. It is the first time you'll ever have fled towards the Ministry of Defence main building in an emergency. Your phone should be on silent, but not expected to be turned off. And the attribution rules for all sessions, apart from the first one with the Secretary of State, will be that prepared remarks are on the record and all subsequent Q&A sessions off the record. For her, the whole of it will be on the record. And of course, it's our speakers who will ensure we've got plenty of food for thought and discussion. And in this first session, we have two speakers providing our keynotes. They couldn't be better placed to set the direction for the conference themes, and indeed they're responsible for setting the direction of the Royal Navy. Penny Mordaunt, the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt, Secretary of State for Defence, appointed on the 1st of May 2019. So this is her 2-week anniversary in this job. She is, of course, a familiar figure in government. I'm pleased to say this is the first time ever that the roles of Minister for Women and Equalities and Secretary of State for Defence have been held by the same person. Of course, she was Secretary of State for International Development. She's previously held several ministerial positions, including in the MOD, Minister of State for the Armed Forces. She's no stranger to defence and a serving Royal Naval Reservist. So although Churchill is quoted as saying, "God save me from a minister who was once a subaltern," I can imagine that our other speaker is quite pleased about the Secretary of State's knowledge and dedication to the Navy. Admiral Sir Philip Jones is our second speaker. If you don't know who he is, you have come into the wrong meeting by accident. He is the First Sea Lord. It's the First Sea Lord's Conference. And he was appointed in 2016. His posts, I won't read them all out, but have included Fleet Commander and Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff, Chief of Staff, Navy Command Headquarters, Assistant Chief of Naval Staff Policy, and a lot of operational service, counter-piracy operations off Somalia, operations in West Africa and the Baltic, counter-drug operations in the Caribbean. So there's almost nowhere in the fleet or the world that Sir Philip hasn't served in some capacity. And like the Secretary of State, he's perfectly placed to expand on the themes for today's conference. A few other words of introduction. As I said before, the conference is for all those interested in sea power, and of course everyone should be interested, because the security of our nation and the global commons on which we depend and prosper is intimately related to Sea power, 95% of our exports and imports travel by sea. The deadweight tonnage of the world trading fleet has doubled since 2005. A lot of the expanding military budgets of the world go on sea power. And the importance of this is seen everywhere. From the latest escalation of trade wars between the US and China and the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative to the targeting of shipping in the Gulf this week and the symbolism of the carrier group deployments there, to the politics of responses to migration across the Mediterranean or the Channel, the integration of autonomous systems and the countering of long-range precision weapons, all the way to debates over securing the appropriate people and resources to sustain the potency of our navies. Sea power is at the heart of trade and war, of cooperation and conflict. And I know you will be talking about naval strategy, technology, and people in the following sessions, but of course they all relate to the biggest trends of all of our lifetime. I always say there are three things, really only three things have happened in our lifetime. The Cold War ended, China arose, and the information revolution began. And everything else is a spin-off of those things in some way. But they've all turned out differently from how we expected. The end of the Cold War has not ended military and diplomatic tension with Russia. The rise of China has boosted the world economy, but also produced a rival idea about how society should be organized. The information revolution was meant to give us liberation, but threatens domination, and was meant to be a unifying factor for humanity, but perhaps is becoming a divisive one. And all of this is the strategic context to how naval strategy and sea power must be developed, seamlessly integrated within national strategy, not just defense and security, but into our industrial and global strategies as well. And of course, there are the issues of technology that you will be discussing, how it must be a powerful enabler, enhancing potency and presence and exploiting autonomy and artificial intelligence to win the kinetic and the economic exchange, rather than simply adding inflationary pressure to other areas of the budget. And people you will be discussing. Always we say our greatest asset. But in the coming years, perhaps the most crucial asset as the source of the innovation necessary to harness these emerging technologies and as the ultimate decision makers and guarantors of our freedoms, whether they be in uniform or otherwise. So this is the context for the Sea Power Conference. As chairman of RUSI, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here and to make her first speech as Secretary of State for Defense, to welcome Penny Mordaunt, who's confronted these challenges from within the service and now in the Cabinet. So I congratulate her on her appointment and invite her to speak to us this morning. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I am delighted to be here. No, more than delighted to be here. I am honoured to be here. Not just to be able to thank RUSI for all it does, but to thank you, and particularly those in uniform, for your service. And, of course, to deliver the Sir Henry Leach Memorial Lecture. For all his considerable achievements, he is perhaps best known for his unwavering resolve. He told Margaret Thatcher not only that the Falkland Islands should be retaken, but that they must be retaken. And not everyone agreed with him, but he had the confidence in the quality of his personnel, that, under-resourced, as even they were then, professionalism and belief in our cause would carry the day. And he wasn't wrong. Maybe if it hadn't been Henry Leach, we would be a different nation today. Some people think we are. They're wrong. We still have the right stuff in the Royal Navy, and for that matter, the British Army, and yes, even the Royal Air Force. For him and for his Prime Minister. In deciding that course of action, the principles were clear. Their confidence and resolve created a focus and an effort to assemble that famous task force and get the job done. Those two great leaders, military and political, provided reassurance in those troubled times. Political turmoil at home, a resurgent left wing, calls on other parts of the exchequer, a distracted America. Sound familiar? In troubled times, we search for those great personal qualities in others to lead our nation and reconnect with the ambitions the people of this country feel so strongly and so intuitively. Leach and his Prime Minister articulated a national mission hardwired into the souls of their nation and its people. How were they able to do that? To swell hearts, to focus minds, to define what it is to be a patriot? Did they use the power of their personal philosophy to mould our great institutions? Actually, it was the opposite. They felt the values of those institutions of our nation so strongly that their personalities were shaped by them. They became the living embodiment of their nation's enduring values. And they were a beacon of freedom to those under tyranny, and they inspired courage in others. They were moved by tolerance, respect, plurality of thought, justice and compassion, and above all else, a love of freedom. They clearly saw what Thatcher called the primacy of the heart, and they accepted no makeshifts, as Sir Henry would have put it. All of us can understand this, because all of us, especially those in public service, have been shaped by those values. Why else would we wish to serve? And when I look around this room on this spring morning, I wonder what your stories are. What has this great nation stamped on your hearts? Why do you find yourselves here? Why is it that we serve? Personally, I can still recall the sight of HMS Hermes leading that task force out of Portsmouth Harbour. And as a 9-year-old, I didn't know much about that scene, but witnessing it and Thatcher's resolve and Leach's confidence, well, I knew Britain stood up to bullies, and I knew that it was important that we did. It was important enough for some of those ships and some of my classmates' fathers not to return. I'd encountered courage, I'd seen duty, and I'd seen sacrifice for something greater than ourselves. And 37 years later, when I was asked by Major General Julian Thompson to address the San Carlos dinner, the reunion of that task force, well, I saw it again. And I can tell you that the veterans remain to this day as uncompromising in their approach to the enemy as they do towards their food and drink. I'm going to talk to you today and in the future about ships, boats, cyber, and all sorts of other things. But I want you to know, however, from the outset, that I understand the business we're in is primarily about people. It's about heart and guts. It's about imagination and belief, vision and ambition. And our country, at such a profound crossroads in its story, facing uncertainty and, yes, opportunity, needs the values that Leach admired like never before. Freedom, democracy, rule of law, and the rules-based order. Our citizens want a nation to be able to affect and improve the world. They want us to go out and sort out problems. And I know from my previous department their generosity and their care for others around the world. They hate that feeling of impotence when we can't protect people. They want us to further our nation's interests. And this means that they want us to remain a nation with the inclination and the ability to act. They want us to influence, to deter, and to intervene. And they want us to be able to do this even when it means us standing alone. Britons intuitively understand global Britain, and you do too, because you are at its heart. You are the foundation of global Britain. You're the ones with the reach, the connections, the platforms, the security and the partnerships. Without you, we cannot protect shipping. And without this, trade deals won't yield dividends. Without you to guard peace and security, nations can't lift themselves out of poverty. Without you to combat threats, whatever their shape and size, evil will prevail. Global Britain is a protector, it's a wealth bringer, it's a problem solver, a lifesaver, and a peace broker. And nothing symbolises our intent and ambition for global Britain and has captured the hearts of our citizens more than our new carriers. They are a mighty symbol of our intent. The most powerful ships Britain has ever built. 9 acres of sovereign territory that will give us the ability to project power from anywhere in the world, whether as part of a discrete operation or in support of land operations or as part of a coalition of allies and partners. They are versatile and they are a global influence. In 2010, as a new MP, when I made the case for the carriers, I just pointed to every humanitarian crisis and brewing conflict situation we had ever experienced since we had carriers. And I challenged people to name one situation in which that capability had not been instrumental in getting a good outcome. Sir Henry only had 2 mini carriers in his day, and I'm sure that he is looking down on us with envy today. Last year, our mighty Queen Elizabeth tested out the F-35B aircraft at Westland. This year, it will be returning to the eastern seaboard to conduct flight trials with our own F-35B future fighter. And when the Prince of Wales joins her in the fleet in the near future, we will have 1 carrier available at very high readiness at all times. And this will match our strategic nuclear deterrent with a conventional one. And I want to make sure that we make the most of this incredible sovereign capability. And that's why today I can announce that we will develop a new policy that will set out how those ships will deliver for our nation in the years ahead. The National Carrier Policy will lay the blueprint for how we use them to deliver global Britain's objectives around the world. Our carriers are setting the tone for the future Navy that I want to see, and they're instilling confidence, closing deals and protecting the rule-based order, and projecting our intent in uncertain and a challenging world, a world that is becoming increasingly more complex. The challenge of China rising, the threat from a resurgent Russia, the ever-changing shape of violent extremism and terrorism, the growth of cyber threats and organised crime, and the grey areas of new weapons and new theatres. There are huge challenges ahead of us, and there will be many demands made of us, so we had better be prepared. Like Sir Henry, when he gatecrashed that emergency cabinet meeting and Thatcher asked him what she could do for him, he replied, "No, Prime Minister, it's what I can do for you." So what are we going to do to stay ready? In the past 12 months, we've been training in Norway's Arctic tundra, drug busting in the Arabian Gulf, establishing field hospitals in South Sudan, helping enforce UN sanctions in the South Pacific, and escorting Russian vessels off the premises. And silent and undetected, you're maintaining our continuous at-sea deterrent. In all that you do, you carry the reputation of Great Britain with you, because you influence and you shape the world around you. You're the prototype that others seek to emulate, and the partner of choice for our allies. And I'm proud that you are strengthening partnerships around the world at all times, with HMS Defender supporting NATO whilst on exercise Formidable Shield, with HMS Montrose and our Mine Countenance Measures Force now permanently in the Middle East, and a naval support facility in Bahrain, keeping vital shipping lanes open, with our Royal Navy soon to sail to the Baltic as part of the Joint Expeditionary Force, reinforcing partnerships with like-minded Northern European allies, and with our development of the North Atlantic Joint Operating Area that will soon guard mile after mile of vital waterway. Our people aren't just exceptionally brave, but they're also enormously innovative and creative. Today, they're doing everything from devising new environmentally friendly ways to power headquarters in the field, to delivering AI and robotics into every fighting arm, courtesy of our pioneering new Naval X accelerator. And at the very pinnacle of the pyramid, you will find the Royal Marines, developing future commando force. In a reimagined global Britain, defence will continue to be the first duty of our nation, but it must be up to our ambition, maintaining a ruthless focus on our mission, becoming more forward deployed, and going out of its way to work with friends and allies. But if our future fleet is to respond to the growing demands, we need to do much more, and investment will be critical. We have done a great deal to drive out the inefficiencies in defence, but there is more for us to do. And today you're going to be hearing about the direction and innovation from the Royal Navy, about our new capabilities coming online and being planned. But I think we need to get some fundamentals right too, if we're going to match the nation's and the Navy's ambition. In 2015, we rightly committed to meet NATO's commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence. Understandably, people focus on that number. Politicians point to it, and rightly encourage other nations to match it. But that is not the whole story. I just want us to briefly recap the headlines from the last 3 defence reviews. In 1997, the review pledged to deliver 32 destroyers and frigates and 2 amphibious assault ships. In the event, we got the 2 assault ships, but only 6 frigates and destroyers. In the 2010 SDSR, we said we would deliver 2 carriers and 19 destroyers and frigates, of which 6 were the Type 45s and 13 were the Type 26s. We got the carriers, but the 13 Type 26s were reduced to 8, and we've ordered 3 of them. And in the last SDSR in 2015, we set out a shopping list of 8 Type 26s, 5 Type 31s, and 2 OPVs, and 4 ballistic missile submarines. I am determined that that will stay on track. I ask you, what is the point of methodically reviewing threats and tasks, formulating capability, and then not delivering it? What's the point of building ships only to mothball them for lack of crews, spares, or funds? What is the point of costly design and innovation if we only intend to build a handful? What is the point of running on old vessels and delaying new ones and running up massive costs in the process? If the Royal Navy and wider defence is to deliver on the ambitions of our country, then we must tackle both the funding and the political behaviours which constantly undermine it. In the coming weeks, I'm going to be saying more about how we build on all the good work and lessons to date, most notably from the Carrier Alliance, to ensure that defence sits at the heart of the prosperity agenda, to end the vicious cycle of unfulfilled SDSRs and more of the same, to create a virtuous circle where we recognise that it's long order books and steady drumbeats in our yards that strengthen our supply chain and bring down the overall cost of procurement. What's needed is a closer partnership with industry that gives them the confidence to invest and build, and us the confidence that we can and we must buy British. We must recognise that if Britain's armed forces don't use it, Britain's businesses will find it harder to sell it. We have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. And we must do more to maximise the full value of our resources to build up Britain. Not only is that necessary in terms of creating skills and resilience, but it's vital in creating an environment where defence gets the critical investment it needs. Now, as I stand before you today, I can't tell you that the Treasury is going to welcome that message. I can't tell you that the Treasurer will agree with all of my message. What I can promise you, though, is that the Treasury will hear this message. We know that defence must play a greater role in the whole of government's prosperity agenda. So what does that mean for industry? It means we're looking for you to match our ambition to get the ships we need the shipbuilding. And that means improving the relationship between industry and government. A few years ago, Sir John Parker's report laid bare the challenges. The old days of changing requirements on a whim, of being vague about what we needed in the long term. That must end. Our recent acquisition review took a sample of live MOD programmes. It found that on average, the initial investment cost of a project rose by 35% and delivery time by 46%. That's just not costing us time and money. That is damaging our operational effectiveness. So my challenge to industry is to become more sustainable, to deliver more value for money, and to stick to fixed project budgets, and to innovate in the way you build, to build up your competitiveness, building exportability in as standard, and to deliver faster. The days of taking decades to produce a ship are over. Now, I know you've been told this before, but what is different now is that both you and I recognise that the politics also needs to change, and we have to continually learn, which is why when I came into the department, I commissioned work to examine the lessons that we must learn from the Mars tanker procurement, especially for our UK supply chain. Britain already has incredible shipbuilding heritage, but I think we should prepare for a fantastic future too. The Aircraft Carrier Alliance showed that Britain has what it takes to produce first-class fifth-generation ships. Just as the lessons of the Type 26 is that we have the capability to design frigates that are the envy of the world. We need to learn these lessons as we bring in our next generation of fleet solid support ships, our logistic backbone. So it's time for a sea change in industry as well. Let's replace Sir John's old vicious cycle with a virtuous circle. And let's remember Sir Henry's favourite words. The sea endures no makeshifts. Discipline, courage, and contempt for all that is pretentious and insincere. These are the teachings of the ocean and the elements, and they have been the qualities in all age of the British sailor. As we prepare for the next chapter for the fleet, as we go into the next CSR, as we transform defence, let's have some honesty about what it takes. Let's have some honesty about what it costs. Let's have some confidence about its value and some rigour in its planning. Let's have some excellence in our partnership and some clarity in our mission. And as your Secretary of State, all I ask is for your help in that task. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Secretary of State. A wide-ranging speech, some powerful statements, an eloquent tribute to Sir Henry Leach. There will certainly be things there that we want to ask about, and we have some time for questions to the Secretary of State before the first Sea Lord speaks. Who would like to ask a question? Yes. Yes, and do say your name and organisation. Yes. Yeah. Microphone's coming. Yeah.
Lucy Fisher from The Times. Secretary of State, you talk about the importance of standing up to bullies, maintaining a rules-based international order, and the challenge posed by rising China. Will your new national carrier policy retain the commitment of your predecessor to send the carrier to China's backyard and ensure freedom of navigation? And more widely, could you say whether you think that Britain is being robust enough in standing up to Beijing?
Well, I'm not going to discuss, as you will understand, future deployments, but I think that our principles are very clear. We have to maintain the rules-based order, we have to maintain the freedom of navigation, and certainly we want to ensure that we have a presence in that part of the world, working with Australia and our other partners in that region. So yes, the policy will continue. The carrier policy, I think, will add to that. It's about what those ships can deliver, both for defence but also to government's wider priorities. So you should expect no change in that from me.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and on the aisle there. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Ben Glaze from the Daily Mirror. You spoke about the importance of buying British, and you also mentioned the Fleet Solid support contracts. Will you commit today to giving that contract to a UK shipyard?
I won't commit to that today, but I hope I have made it crystal clear that not only do I think we can be competitive in shipbuilding if we get this partnership with industry right, but I also think it's necessary for us to be able to deliver the fleet that we want in the future. So that's what I am going to be focused on. I think I understand very clearly what else industry needs from us and our behaviours at the MOD and in the services to be able to give it the confidence to invest and commit fully to being a shipbuilder in the UK.
Thank you. Yes. There was next question. Right to the back then. Yeah.
Rosie Layden from Forces Television. You're saying that the Treasury may not be pleased to hear your message about more money for defence. Do you have a figure in mind, a percentage of GDP in mind? What are you going to be asking for?
Well, I think that part of the problem is that politicians, have picked figures out of the air and said, that's what we need, this sounds about right. What we have to do, and I think the only way to get purchasing credibility with the Treasury, is to be focused on our task. What is it that we're asking the Royal Navy and wider defence to do? And the problem is that we have been distracted from that question by 2%, is it a floor, is it a ceiling, other opinions that are expressed about how much we should be spending. I will be focused on the tasks that we have to do to deliver on what our nation needs, what we need to do to protect the UK, our first duty, and also to deliver the vision that the British public have for global Britain. That's what we need to focus on, and we need honesty about what that will cost. And we, whether we sit in the MOD, in the services or in industry, also have to understand the behaviours and the practices that have been in existence but admittedly are improving that rack up costs. And we need to address both of those things. But I will be a strong advocate for defence and ensuring that the services get what they need in my discussions with the Treasury.
Yeah, then over in the corner there.
Dan Saber from The Guardian. You also made an announcement overnight about an amnesty for personnel against historical prosecutions. Just in your own words, why do you think that shouldn't cover Northern Ireland?
Well, I do think it should cover Northern Ireland. I think the problem is that we have failed to make progress on the whole lawfare issue because we have been held up waiting for other things to happen. I made two announcements overnight. One is about trying to address the wider problem, including an assumption that that prosecutions will not be brought, about developing what derogating from the European Convention on Human Rights means, and other things as well, which I think will close down litigation, vexatious litigation. We know the motivations that has driven some of the claims that have been made when IHAT was up and running. I think we need to address that issue. But in doing so, we will help ourselves come up with an answer for Northern Ireland, where I fear we are in danger of repeating what happened with IHAT. So the two things I think we need to do is that wider solution for the veteran community and those still serving throughout the world. We also need to do something else too. And earlier this week, I agreed with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland that in whatever her next steps will be in trying to resolve this issue and setting up a process and meeting her obligations in the Stormont House Agreement, that defence, our learnings from the IHAT experience, plus the voices of the veteran community that this is affecting, will be formally heard in that process. This is not going to be resolved overnight, but those two things I think will take us forward. And it is a personal priority of mine that we get this resolved and we stop this chilling effect that is plaguing veterans who really deserve our care and respect.
Now, we've just got another 6 minutes or so very sharp questions. There's one right over by the curtain there. Then I've got some MPs bursting to ask questions here at the front. We'll fit them in, a couple of them.
Thank you very much. David Bond from the Financial Times. Secretary of State, what's your view on whether Huawei should be allowed to build future 5G networks in the UK?
It will not be surprised that I have my views, but I'm going to express them in the National Security Council. What I can assure people is that everyone round the table is appraised of the facts and everyone understands what their duty is.
Couple of MPs. Anne-Marie Trevelyan, can we get the microphone down here?
Thank you. Secretary of State, we talk about our military people as our greatest asset, but government is run through finances and they are classified as a cost. How do you think you can take on the Treasury to change it so that they are part of the balance sheet alongside our carriers and our ships? Those people are what we invest in and we should actually finance them as an asset.
Well, I think you've given very good examples, Anne-Marie, in the work that you've done in highlighting some of the nutty decisions we make. We invest, I know you use this example a lot, but a huge amount, hundreds of thousands of pounds in particular individuals' training. But because we don't allow their partner to deviate from various shades of magnolia that they might want to paint their house, we lose them out of the services. So we have to look at the whole package here. I am very appraised of that, and I have a great ministerial team, and we are looking at what further we can do to ensure that that whole package is there. We want to retain these people. We invest huge amounts in them, and if they have short careers with us, that's not good for the British taxpayer.
Right, three more questions. Mark Francois.
Thank you much. Mark Francois from the Defence Select Committee. As a son of a naval veteran, Secretary of State, I genuinely very much enjoyed your speech. Congratulations on your announcement overnight about veterans, which I'm sure will be very welcome. But you yourself referred to IHAT. Would you agree that as politicians we have a moral duty to defend those who defended us? And would you promise us that you will do all that you can within government to make sure that we didn't abolish IHAT for Iraq, only to create IHAT 2 for Northern Ireland?
I will undertake to do that. I think that IHAT was set up with the best intentions at heart. It was set up to try and prevent our armed forces having to go to the International Criminal Court. But the way it was set up, the legal aid regime, and of course legal firms who were interested in making a quick buck, that soon escalated into not the pursuit of justice, but the pursuit of profit, and we all know what happened. That is understandable. It's not forgivable, but it is understandable. I think what would not be understandable or forgivable is if we repeated that and failed to learn the lessons of the experience before. This is not about preventing someone who's committed a crime from facing justice. This is about stopping an industry that surrounds these processes, which is not about the pursuit of justice. And we all know the effects it has, both in terms of veterans and the stresses that it puts them under, but also how it affects our operations. We know that the lawfare issue is having a direct impact on the decisions that our serving personnel take in the field, and that is quite wrong, and it has to stop. So I will take whatever action at the speed I can to resolve this issue. It is a priority for me.
Final couple of questions. Yes, right in the back corner.
Peter Roberts from RUSI. Given the threat environment you described, do you think you can honestly buy a warship for £250 million?
Well, as you will know from my speech, we have to be realistic about the capability that we need. These are light frigates, although they're not particularly light, but they need to be frigates. They need to be able to carry out the tasks that we require a frigate to do, and we need to have flexibility about what platforms we can put to particular tasks and situations we might find ourselves in. So what I can say to you is that as well as looking at the costs, as well as trying to drive down those costs, and I think the only way you do that is to have a long, forgive me for saying it, but a long-term plan to enable industry to drive down those costs and to invest to do that and make the savings that you would from ship to ship. That was the plan with the Type 45s. That was the plan with the Type 26s. And we need to make sure it's the plan with the Type 31s too. But I am very focused on the capability that they carry. And as well as looking long term, I'm also going to be focused on ensuring the capability we have now is the best it can be.
Final question. Sorry, I can't fit everybody in. Yes, just here.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Beale from the BBC. You mentioned IHAT. There are still 150 investigations into British troops who served in Iraq ongoing. Are you saying that you're going to put a moratorium on those investigations? And then secondly, the Foreign Secretary says we should be spending more than 2% of GDP on defence. I just wonder why the Defence Secretary can't quite say that in as many words.
Well, I think you'll find that since 2010, this Defence Secretary has said that many times over. But what I also think is important, and politicians always say it's a floor, not a ceiling. What we have to do, rather than make commitments on numbers of ships that we're never going to purchase, rather than saying, I'm going to spend 3%, I'm going to spend 4%, someone over there wants us to spend 5%, we have to look at what it is we need to do. We have to look at what the capability is and the task that we are asking our services to perform. That is what needs to drive that number. We all know where the gap is. We all know the size of the gap that we need to fill currently. We need to look at that. We need to look at what we need to do in the future, all of the fantastic capabilities you're going to be hearing about today. But that's what's going to drive me. I'm not going to be shy about asking for more money, but it's going to be linked to the job that the armed forces needs to do. And in relation to IHAT, I've obviously made some remarks about the wider lawfare issue and Northern Ireland. I will be saying some things in the near future about IHAT and other cases.
Well, thank you. We must stick to our time. There's been a lot of questions, and I want to thank the Secretary of State not only for her speech, but also for answering questions in a very knowledgeable and direct way, which not every minister 2 weeks into the job is able to do, I can say, with long experience of these matters. And so I know we will all, irrespective of politics, wish you well, Penny, in your new position. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And the only person as appropriate as the Secretary of State for Defence to open our conference is the First Sea Lord. It is the First Sea Lord's conference. And so as soon as he's got his tag out of his notes,
I won't waste time.
I've already introduced him, and it's over to him for the next keynote address. Thank you very much indeed.
Lord Hague, Secretary of State, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and a very warm welcome, if I may, to a conference that carries my name, or at least the authority of my office. It's great to have you here at RUSI, particularly if you're back for the second year after our conference last year. And could I begin with expressing a couple of words of thanks to Lord Hague for anchoring this event as the RUSI chair, of course to our new Secretary of State for your powerful and compelling introduction to our conference, and to Dr. Karen Van Hippel, the Director General, and all the team here at RUSI who've done so much to facilitate this event. It's a long day, it's a full day, and I hope you enjoy it. I'd like to thank in advance, and I hope in anticipation of delivery, the excellent range of speakers and panel moderators we have here today. We have deliberately selected issues and selected speakers to broaden and diversify what we're looking at here in this conference today. We've broadened it away from just having chiefs of navy and naval practitioners to those who can help shape what indeed the future of sea power should be. And last of all, thank you to all of you for coming. The conference, as you can see, is healthily sold out. It's a powerful contribution from my perspective to what we're doing to try and shape the future of the naval service. And it is particularly heartening to see those of you who have returned from the conference last year. I hope that's because you were stimulated by the debate then and you want more. I think if there's any doubt as to the utility of events like this, last year's conference emphatically dispelled those. And in the excellent conference report which Peter Roberts and Siddharth Kaushal put together, I hope some of you have had a chance to see it, it concluded that the analysis of future naval warfare, the consideration of what the range of potential futures for the Navy might look like, had perhaps not been receiving the attention it deserved. And so, as the changing threat environment has made sea power a more focal issue than perhaps it had been for recent years, it seemed right that the defence and security community is once again concerning itself with maritime strategy. Now, the output from last year's conference has led to many strands of work within the Royal Navy, I'm pleased to say, some of which remain ongoing today, not least an examination of how we engage with and tap into that knowledge and expertise that's available to us in academia, in think tanks, the wider defence enterprise out into industry, and of course our international partners and allies, to make sure that as we look to develop our understanding of the changing maritime security climate, we do it with the benefit of all of those perspectives. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased to say that this conference now sits in something of a continuum of the discussion we're having right across the piece, one that began with this conference last year, continues here today, and I hope in particular will have a powerful manifestation at DSEI in Docklands this September, where we hope to have some significant announcements for how we're taking the Navy's new capability and innovation forward. Now, the very fact that that continuum has a rhythm to it that is not that easy to change, the date for this conference was set before the date for the first Sea Lord supersession. So my successor, Tony Radikin, who many of you will know, he and I sat down a number of months ago and discussed how to play this. There is a powerful case that it should be him here now and not me. There is at least an equally powerful case that if I start the conference today with a keynote, he finishes at the end of the day. But he's demurred from that with my support. He is quite rightly on that precious, what we call in the services, leave between appointments, having handed over as second Sea Lord a couple of weeks ago. So he's reading, he's thinking, he's visiting, he's writing a command plan, and we agreed that he should be allowed time to take his proper time to arrive in post, to take stock and give his views in due course. I suspect if he takes longer than 2 weeks to do it in at least one matter, his Secretary of State will be asking why he can't get out on the stump faster. You set a very high bar for the new First Sea Lord. But suffice to say, Tony and I are very clearly aligned in our thinking, and I'm very excited at the leadership he's going to bring to the Navy. There will be no contest for this particular Iron Throne. He arrives in King's Landing without an army that has to depose me. I knew some of you would guess it, even if most of you didn't. But back to today, you've heard a very powerful articulation from the Secretary of State about the what we're doing in sea power. So I wanted to underpin that with a little bit of the why as a leader into what I think much of the rest of the day will be, which is about the how. So the start point of our discussion today, from my perspective, is the changing threat environment. That formed a very major part of our deliberations at this conference last year, and we went into that in some detail. And at the start of the day, I would characterize the way I see that as having evolved in 3 key areas. The first of those is the continual erosion we're seeing in the rules that govern the international system, the system that has for so long provided the basis for our security and prosperity, especially through what has become known as grey zone activity. But we in the Ministry of Defence would perhaps more accurately describe that as activity which sees a perpetual state of conflict where actions are just below the threshold of traditional conventional conflict, but nevertheless pose a significant challenge. And we've seen that expanding even in the last year since the last RUSI conference, and more on that shortly. The second is the diversification of potential adversaries as the growing list of non-state actors who are engaged in serious organised crime and terrorism, which have been our focus for much of the 21st century so far, are now matched by the return of great power competition. And then thirdly, by the intensification of threats as weapon proliferation and technological advance puts even more capable weaponry into the hands of ever more diverse potential adversaries. And here the role of information and cyber opens up entirely new domains in which we in the maritime must be ready to fight and win. Now, you may say none of those developments are unique to the maritime domain, and you would be right. Indeed, the Chief of Defence Staff, General Sir Nick Carter, was here in RUSI only a couple of months ago saying precisely that on a much wider defence perspective. And you won't be surprised to hear that even with only 5 weeks to go, I agree with absolutely everything he said that day. But I would also argue that the modern maritime domain perhaps presents the most fertile of all environments as a breeding ground for this sub-threshold of conflict activity, exploited by the full range of actors, be they criminals, be they non-state actors, or be they peer competitor states. And all of that is enabled through access to increasingly sophisticated technology, and they use that as a means of pursuing their aims. A couple of examples, as I mentioned just before. In the southern Red Sea, we are now seeing increasingly complex physical and manifestations of maritime power by the Houthi rebels in the way they target Saudi-led coalition forces at sea. And of course, their discrimination is not always enabling them to just target Saudis. Their increased use of practical but unconventional technology, such as remote-controlled and autonomous surface craft, is a particular concern to global mariners. The use of sea mines and other potentially lethal weapons adjacent to such a pivotal maritime choke point adds further tension that could only destabilise what is already a long-running and damaging 4-year conflict, but have very significant repercussions for global maritime trade. And then look at events in the Kerch Strait last November, as Russian Navy, Coast Guard and intelligence agencies came together to ultimately both detain 3 Ukrainian naval vessels and, by use of a cleverly positioned commercial tanker under the newly completed Kerch Bridge, establish a temporary blockade which effectively denied access to the Ukrainian sole entry point to the Sea of Azov, a strategically important access to their eastern Ukrainian ports. Now, actions like those, regardless of the judgments from the legal deliberations which are still ongoing in that latter case, I think we can safely characterise as examples of maritime sub-threshold grey zone activity, which is being used by one state to exert sea control to the detriment of another. And that's a powerful development. When it comes to state-on-state competition in the maritime domain, the use of territorial sea disputes is particularly compelling. The University of Dundee's Maritime Boundaries Research Institute did a piece of work in 2015 which identified that 57% of the world's maritime boundaries remain unresolved. And yet, in a world of dwindling natural resources, where the significance of 12-mile territorial waters limits, and perhaps even more so the 200-mile exclusive economic zones, through the provisions of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, are becoming of enormous value to coastal states' energy, mining, fishing and telecommunication industries. And therefore, it's perhaps no wonder that where disagreement exists between states as to where these boundaries should be drawn, resolution often reaches far beyond just legal complexity and into grey zone activity, where coercion can be used to reinforce territorial claims, and where a power imbalance exists between the bordering states, you see it most significant. Arguably, the most regularly cited example of this is in the South China Sea, where, contrary to the rulings in July 2016 by the Independent Arbitration Tribunal established under UNCLOS, specifically in relation to the Chinese claim on the 9-dash line and the status of both the Spratly Islands and the Scarborough Shoal, China has maintained its territorial claims in that area. Associated claims on indigenous resources in the region, of course, go with that. And those demands have thus far been resisted by China's neighbours, and whilst I don't plan to comment on the complex legal judgment that are still underway in the arbitration panel on those territorial disputes, I'm pretty clear that the relevance of the ever more capable and assertive PLA Navy in that region is not lost on anyone and is linked to those claims. Now, there were those who were questioning why a territorial dispute half a world away matters in the UK. But I would say that UNCLOS is one of those cornerstones of international peace and security that provide a neutral mechanism in order to help allocate the world's maritime resources. And if we allow UNCLOS to be undermined in one area, wherever that area may be, whatever the case may be, I think we weaken it everywhere. It would precipitate a world where countries feel free to ignore international treaties which don't suit them. And then, of course, no agreement is safe. International order and international security could easily begin to break down. And that's why a global outlook and a commitment to a rules-based approach is essential in the UK. Those two things are two of the 5 core values that underpin a new strategy we have in the UK called Maritime 2050. Now, you could understand a First Sea Lord releasing a strategy like that, or at least the Policy Directorate of the Ministry of Defence. But as many of you will know, it's actually a Department of Transport strategy released in January this year, following wide cross-government stakeholder input. Maritime 2050 very succinctly explains that beyond the intuitive importance of the sea to an island nation, it's why it's vital for the UK to pursue a maritime strategy. The well-established growth in seaborne trade, the changing shape and age profile of the world's population, the eastward geographical shift in global economic centre of gravity, and climate change are all trends identified in that strategy which will shape the future of global economies in the coming decades. And for each of these trends, there are strong arguments to justify why a maritime solution, if it's suitably harnessed, can offer the UK not just economic resilience, but increasingly competitive advantage. So whilst our country's physical geography may give us no choice but to embrace the incredibly complex range of challenges that are present in the maritime domain, both in the near abroad and the further afield, the significant opportunities are there to be capitalised on. And that's something that, if I may, our country, I think, has a long and distinguished record of doing precisely that. Arguably the single factor that several centuries ago secured Britain's place at the top of the international system came from the maritime, and I would suggest they are still the single most important factor that keeps us there today. We're not alone in recognising the benefits of a maritime strategy either. By way of evidence, you only need to look at some of the massive infrastructure projects that are affecting the maritime sector around the world. Look, for example, at the recent expansion of the Panama Canal as a reflection of the physical growth in the size of world shipping, something that is in turn leading to expansion of very large port facilities around the world. Look at Gwadar in Pakistan, look at Duqm in Oman. Notably amongst these expansions, of course, China's One Belt, One Road strategy seeks to upgrade several facilities on their maritime Silk Road connecting China and Europe. Meanwhile, in the military sphere, the latest Russian maritime doctrine, personally approved by President Putin in July 2017, has identified the Atlantic as a main regional priority area for them, and is unequivocal when the strategy states, and I quote, "Naval activities are the highest state priorities, and the Navy is the main component and foundation of the global potential of the Russian Federation." In other words, it is through naval operations that Russia seeks to achieve its stated objectives. And to this approach can be attributed their enduring naval presence. The frequency of Russian Federation Navy vessels transiting through the Atlantic area of the sea lines of communication have now become a new baseline for us to contend with. The continued funding of their main Directorate for Deep Sea Research is also a component of that strategy. And I think we can anticipate Russia employing a combination of both conventional and non-conventional methods to carry on exerting its influence in the North Atlantic, and we have to be ready for that. Put simply, in the years to come, Russian effort to exploit sea power in and around our very own backyard here in the UK is likely to be a constant, something we will not be able to ignore. So what does all this mean for the Royal Navy? Well, having established, I hope, the importance of a maritime strategy for the UK, one that is inherently global in outlook and seeks to preserve the rules-based order, the role of sea power in supporting that strategy, I hope, becomes self-evident. And for that sea power to be effective, it needs to be able to address the full gamut of diversifying and intensifying threats in both the current maritime domain and the future maritime domain. And this is a domain that I've mentioned earlier, requires us to deliver effect on, above and below the waves and in space and cyberspace, and also have the capacity to do it from the sea to the land. Now, at one end of the scale, that means being ready to respond to natural disasters almost anywhere, and the provision of humanitarian assistance that our nation is called on to provide. Somewhere in the middle of that scale, it means being able to deliver effective constabulary operations to disrupt illicit activity on the sea, such as piracy, illegal trafficking and smuggling. And then at the top end of the scale, it means effective deterrence against peer and near-peer adversaries, deterring them from actions that would threaten our interests and potentially provoke escalation into conflict. Now, of course, for any deterrence capability to be credible, well-established theory tells us that it must be capable of causing severe enough repercussions to make action unpalatable in the eyes of your opponent. And it must be available for use at a time and place of our choosing, and there must be no doubt about our will to use it if necessary. And it's the combination of these factors, I believe, that drives our requirement for capabilities that are at the absolute peak of maritime military capability. Anything else is not credible. So it's the range and breadth of activity and the associated capabilities that go with them that will enable the Royal Navy to be ready to answer the credible sea power requirements in support of our nation's wider maritime strategy. And it's the balanced fleet capable of anything from that humanitarian assistance right up to high-end warfighting, and to do it sustainably around the world across all domains is going to be key. But of course, that's no small ask, especially when faced with the significant perennial challenges we face. And we're going to get into many of these during the course of the day. Firstly, our people challenge. It's long running. It's well known to many of you here. It's not unique to the Royal Navy by any means. In part, of course, it's the result of demographics, which affect the external employment market. But it's somewhat exacerbated, perhaps inevitably, by the highly technical nature of our service, and therefore the need for people with those skills, combined with the unique nature of life at sea, which is increasingly divergent from the expectations of modern generations who've grown up with near instant access to the internet, to connection with family and friends and to social media, we take time to explain to our potential recruits how that will work for them. And we've made significant strides to resolve our most pressing people shortfall, engineers in both the surface and submarine fleet. But this is going to remain an enduring issue for some time to come. Economy and demography are defining that for us. Secondly, the relentless pace of technological advance has proved sometimes almost impossible to keep up with, not least because those same procurement cycles the Secretary of State described take too long for us to generate new complex warships, or even to evolve the systems within them during their service life. Often we've had the chance in the last 20 years to mitigate this delta by the capability overmatch we have to potential competitors. But as I mentioned at the start, this is something we are increasingly losing as they gain greater capability. So this calls for innovation to identify and exploit the latest cutting-edge technology that will enable us to remain competitive, and faster acquisition processes to get that technology from the drawing board into the hands of the warfighter before our adversaries can get it. And this constant requirement to improve productivity so we make the best use of scarce public resource, something that's been driving trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, between capability and mass, between affordability and lethality for a long time, will continue to need to be addressed. Here again, I think we're seeing signs of improvement, not least following last autumn's budget statement. None of you will be surprised to hear me say that the long-term success will be based on a long-term plan. I could not echo the Secretary of State's words more. We have to sustain this forward through successive spending reviews and strategic defence and security reviews. That's the message of Sir John Parker's shipbuilding strategy. But for all these perennial challenges, I am proud to say the Royal Navy continues to deliver where it matters on operations. And you'd be pleased to hear I'm not going to give you a list of them. The Secretary of State covered the most important ones, and I'm grateful to her for doing so. But in the last 12 months, since I spoke at this conference, we have been on every ocean of the world and operating on every continent with our Royal Navy and our Royal Marines. We've had some conspicuous successes along the way. Whether upholding UN Security Council resolutions, whether providing short-term training teams across Africa, whether refreshing our littoral strike credentials in a variety of challenging environments, we're about to do that in the Baltic, or whether restoring our carrier strike capability, they've all been notable. And not to mention, of course, that remarkable achievement that we commemorated only 2 weeks ago of 50 years of unbroken, continuous at-sea deterrence. All of these challenges, all the areas where we've continued to meet what has been asked of us, and in many cases exceed the defence planning assumptions, have, I think, been a source of great pride to the Royal Navy. It's been my privilege to lead. And the very thing that makes the Royal Navy unique within defence, our ability to deliver that influence and political choice through persistent standoff presence, which gives engagement without embroilment, as it's so often referred to, I think we'll continue to see the outputs of our services asked for at sky-high levels, both within defence and across Whitehall. And that's a good thing. But if you set the bar high through output, you've got to find a sustainable way in which you can carry on delivering it. And that's a key part of my job and that of my successor. In support of this, we've established a bold vision for the Royal Navy. We want to operate differently by the mid-20s to be able to defend our nation's interests and deliver political choice while remaining ready to fight at sea and from the sea wherever we're asked to do so. And we've begun that transformation. The modernising defence programme powerfully enables us to do so. We absolutely recognise the need to mobilise to confront the threats we see now, to modernise against the future threats, and to transform the way we do business to stay cutting edge and cost efficient. And in that regard, I don't by any means consider the modernising defence programme as something that's being done to the Navy. It's very much something in which we have embraced the journey and go hand in hand with the rest of defence. And we're absolutely clear where we want that transformation journey to take us. A Navy that can operate differently, that can maximise operational output, that works hand in glove with industry to find new solutions that bring capability to the warfighter faster. And I'd just like to close, if I may, with this thought. We're seeing a number of significant anniversaries this year. I've mentioned CASD 50 already. but also the 70th anniversary of the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty, a very significant moment in the UK defence journey, beginning the organisation that remains at the cornerstone of our defence strategy to this day. And in 3 weeks' time, we're going to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the biggest naval and amphibious operation ever mounted. You will, of course, all think of it as Operation Overlord, but I like to think of Operation Neptune. And D-Day specialists will know that that was the maritime operation that enabled the wider joint campaign on the beaches of Normandy. And from those beaches in Normandy, right away through NATO's posture in the Cold War, right up to the conflicts we're engaged in today, we have always been stronger when we work with allies and partners, and that is our mantra going forward today, again, as you heard the Secretary of State say. And we don't just want to be a bit part in those alliances and coalitions, both within the NATO framework and in wider coalitions. We are always proud to take a leading role, and that is invariably expected of us. And now, as we look at the complex maritime security climate of the future, whether we're operating as part of a UK joint force or an international combined force, the Royal Navy has that ambition to lead, to be the supported commander, to be the framework nation. But if we're going to be credible in that leadership role, we need to also lead thinking within defence across government with our allies and out into the wider maritime enterprise to make sure we can correctly design the maritime force for tomorrow and correctly recruit and retain the people to man it, and do so in peace and in war. We've set that headmark high. It's an old adage that no one has the monopoly on good ideas. That's why we have conferences like today, so that you can help us on that journey. But now is the time to test that headmark and to find out whether we can improve it yet further for the next generation. My successor, Tony Radakin, stands ready to lead that work powerfully, starting 5 weeks today. And you will, I'm sure, be hearing from him soon as practitioners and advocates of the maritime components, as you all are here today, and the maritime use of national power. I know that he can rely on your support as much as I've had the privilege to do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Sir Philip. You can really see there the experience he's brought to this role, and the experience of 3 years in this role, a very wide-ranging address that raises a lot of subjects and issues. So we've got 10 minutes or a little more for questions. This question-and-answer session is off the record, like all the subsequent question-and-answer sessions for the remainder of the conference. And these MPs are really keen, so